The hot sun baked the pavement mercilessly as Jaden, a black boy at 12, walked slowly home from school. Sweat glistened on his face, and he was carrying an old backpack with a ribbon tied around it. The prosthetic leg that replaced his right leg was chafing in the heat, and the pain increased with each step. Jaden was used to days like this. He knew no one would stop to ask how he was feeling. But this day was different. A siren suddenly sounded on the deserted street, shrill and commanding. Jaden flinched as the patrol car swerved to the sidewalk and stopped right in front of him. The door slammed shut, and a tall, stout man in a sheriff's uniform, with dark glasses and a cold, icy stare, stepped out of the car. "Hey, boy," the sheriff called loudly, approaching. His voice was as sharp as a whip. "Stay right where you are." Jaden froze. He didn't understand why he'd been approached, but his heart beat faster. He'd heard of such encounters, and every story told by his elders had ended in something terrible. "What's in your backpack?" the sheriff asked, eyeing the boy suspiciously. Nothing, sir, just textbooks," Jaden replied, trying to remain calm, though his voice shook. The sheriff squinted, taking off his glasses, and his gaze grew hard, as if he saw something in Jaden that wasn't there. He took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "And why are you walking so slowly? What's wrong with your leg?" he asked coldly, his gaze falling on the prosthetic. Jaden, feeling his chest tighten, lowered his eyes. "I have, a prosthetic, sir." There was silence for a moment, but it was louder than any words. The sheriff looked closely at the boy's artificial leg, and a strange grin appeared on his face. "A prosthetic, huh?" He stretched out, his voice sounding like he didn't believe Jaden. "What are you hiding in there?" "Nothing, sir," Jaden answered quickly, fearfully backing away. "Come over here," the sheriff ordered. The seconds seemed like an eternity. Jaden couldn't believe this was happening to him. He wanted to run, to hide, but the sheriff's heavy, commanding voice paralyzed him. The boy took a step forward, though instinct told him otherwise. He felt the tension in the air become almost palpable. The sheriff bent to his leg, and Jaden realized that this was only the beginning of something terrible. The sheriff stared at Jaden as if trying to see into his soul. His eyes glittered predatorily as his gaze slid from the boy's face to his backpack and prosthesis. "You're moving too slowly," he said sharply. "Tired of carrying something? Or do you just want to avoid attention?" Jaden felt as if his feet were anchored to the ground. He knew it didn't matter whether he answered yes or no. The sheriff had already made up his mind. "I'm just going home, sir," Jaden replied quietly, trying not to look at the man. The sheriff drew close enough that his breath burned the boy's face. "Home?" he asked with a grin of contempt. "I wonder what you carry with you. Maybe something that isn't yours." No, sir." Jaden swallowed hard, feeling his voice shake, but the sheriff didn't stop. He squinted his eyes and threw it sharply. "What's that backpack? Give it to me." He yanked the backpack from the boy's hands with such force that he nearly fell. Jaden tried to object, but the words were stuck in his throat as the sheriff began rummaging through his things as if they were trash. "Textbooks," he said dismissively, tossing them to the ground. "A waste of time." The sheriff turned to the boy, his face a mask of raw anger. "Are you sure you're not hiding something in here? Maybe you put the booty in the wrong place?" he asked, obviously referring to the prosthetic. No, sir." Jaden backed away, but the sheriff stepped forward sharply, closing the distance. "Too sneaky, huh? You think you can fool me? Do you know how often people like you escape justice?" His voice got even louder. I'll tell you right now, you're no exception to me." Jaden felt his eyes fill with tears, but he couldn't let himself cry. It would only make the sheriff angrier. "I didn't do anything," he whispered, but the sheriff wasn't listening. He grabbed Jaden's shoulder roughly and leaned in so close that the boy had to look away. "Stop lying, kid. Either you're going to come clean, or I'm going to have to help you." At that moment, Jaden noticed that a couple of passers-by had slowed their steps, watching the scene, but neither of them stopped to intervene. They merely cast glances and quickly moved on. The sheriff, noticing this, smirked. "See? Nobody cares about you," he said. "So do as I say, and this will all be over quickly." Jaden realized that it would be nearly impossible to get out of this situation. His heart was beating like crazy, and his hands were shaking. He couldn't believe this was happening to him. "Sit down," commanded the sheriff sharply. The boy complied, lowering himself to the sidewalk. The sheriff leaned over his leg, intending to check his prosthesis. "Let's see what you're hiding in there," he threw with a sneer. Jaden wanted to scream, but only watched silently as the sheriff removed his prosthetic. At that moment, his fear turned to absolute despair. The prosthesis came off Jaden's leg with a crunch of clasps, exposing the boy's skinny, vulnerable limb. He felt the first tear roll down his cheek but quickly brushed it away, trying not to show weakness. The sheriff held the prosthesis in his hand as if it were evidence that was about to uncover a terrible conspiracy. "You think you're smarter than me?" the sheriff said loudly, turning to the boy. His voice, full of contempt, echoed down the street. "Wearing that as a cover, huh? You think people like you can just walk the streets and fool us?" Passers-by slowed their steps, some glancing furtively at the scene. No one interfered, but their prying and judgmental glances made Jaden's humiliation all the more unbearable. "I didn't do anything, sir," the boy whispered again, but his voice was weak and almost lost under the weight of what was happening. The sheriff turned sharply toward him, his face contorted with anger. "Shut up," he shouted, making Jaden flinch. "People like you are always doing something. Thieves, liars. You think you can just hide behind pity?" He raised the prosthetic higher so it could be seen by anyone who walked by. "Look at this," he continued loudly, addressing the casual onlookers. "That's what they keep us doing, pretending to be victims so they can do their dirty work." People started to whisper, but most turned away, pretending they didn't want to be a part of it. Jaden felt his heart break. Every word the sheriff said hit him like a punch. He lowered his head so he couldn't see those who were looking at him, but the man's loud voice kept him from hiding from the shame. "Tell me what you stole," the sheriff continued, his face now a few inches from the boy's. "Or do you want me to find it myself?" Jaden tried to pull himself together. "Yeah, I didn't steal anything, sir," he finally said a little louder, but his voice was still shaking. The sheriff laughed evilly. "You're a liar," he hissed. "Of course you didn't steal, just like the rest of them, huh?" He threw the prosthetic to the ground with such force that it hit the sidewalk and rolled to the edge of the road. "Is that all you have?" he continued, ignoring the shocked looks of the occasional passerby. "Is that a pathetic excuse for a normal life? You think this piece of plastic makes you human?" The boy couldn't stand it and raised his head, looking straight into the sheriff's eyes. "Yeah, I just wanted to get home," he said, his voice suddenly stronger. The sheriff froze, surprised that the boy dared to answer, but a new flame of rage flared in his eyes. "The house," he interjected, moving closer to the boy. "Your home is where you learn how to lie and steal." The passers-by began to disperse more quickly. some pulling out their phones, but the sheriff didn't seem to notice. He picked up the prosthetic again, looked it over, and then headed for the nearest trash can. "You deserve it," he said, looking at Jaden before tossing the prosthetic into the trash. The boy closed his eyes as he heard the sound of the blow. He felt a lump come to his throat, but he didn't let the tears escape. He didn't want the sheriff to see his weakness, but inside he was broken. The sheriff, pleased with his show of strength, smirked. "Remember that," he said, leaning toward the boy. "If I were you, I wouldn't go outside again." Jaden remained seated on the sidewalk, his gaze fixed on where his prosthesis lay in the trash can. Pain, anger, and shame boiled up inside him. Passers-by who were watching what was happening turned away, hurrying onward. No one reached out to him for help, and in that moment, Jaden realized that no one was coming to help. But it wasn't his weakness. It was the weakness of those who were silent. The sheriff walked over to the trash can where the prosthetic was lying and, with a mocking grin, took it out. He held it up like a trophy, raising it higher for everyone around him to see. Jaden, sitting on the sidewalk, felt his anger and humiliation building. "Or maybe we missed something important," the sheriff said loudly, turning to the boy. "You could have hidden something inside, couldn't you? People like you can be resourceful." Jaden looked at him with horror. No, sir, there's nothing there," he began, but his voice betrayed him again. The sheriff stepped closer, scrutinizing the prosthetic as if studying a complex mechanism. "I've never seen such gadgets." His voice was saturated with contempt. "Do you know how many times I've seen people like you use such things to carry things that don't belong to them?" He turned to the passers-by again, as if demanding their support. "Look at this," he said loudly, addressing the crowd. "This guy could hide anything, right in this." Some of the passers-by muttered something under their breath and quickened their steps to get away as quickly as possible. Others furtively filmed what was happening on their phones, but no one dared to interfere. "There's nothing there," Jaden repeated, his voice louder. "Yeah, I didn't steal it." But the sheriff wasn't listening. He began to shake the prosthesis as if something might fall out of it. Then, grinning, he set it on the ground and kicked it so that it flew a few feet away. "If you're sure there's nothing there, then you have nothing to fear, right?" His words sounded like a sneer. Jaden couldn't hold back any longer. He stood up, trying to walk to his prosthetic, but the pain in his leg and the humiliation made each step excruciating. "Take your time, boy," the sheriff said sharply, blocking his path. "I haven't finished checking your valuable leg yet." He bent down, grabbed the prosthetic, and began to examine it, peering inside as if he expected to find hidden jewelry. "Well," he said after a moment, looking at the boy, "maybe you're not that cunning. But you know, I find it hard to believe that someone like you would just come home from school." Jaden felt the sheriff's words hit him like a hammer. "People like you don't learn. People like you look for the easy way out." The sheriff's voice grew louder and louder, drawing the attention of more people. "That's not true," Jaden shouted, clenching his fists. The sheriff stopped and turned slowly toward him. Gloating flashed in his eyes. "Ah, now you've decided to raise your voice?" he said sarcastically. "Look around you. Do you think anyone cares about you?" The boy looked around. Passers-by quickly averted their gazes or looked at their phones. He felt the loneliness overwhelm him with renewed vigor. The sheriff stepped closer, holding the prosthetic like a weapon. "I'll tell you what, boy," he said, his voice icy again. "You can scream all you want, but I know you're not as innocent as you want to appear." He tossed the prosthetic back into the trash, showing his contempt again. Now, unless you want to spend the rest of the day at the station, get out of here. Jaden felt his hands shaking with anger, but he knew there was nothing he could do. He slowly made his way to the trash can to retrieve the prosthetic, feeling the stares of the sheriff and everyone around him. When he lifted the prosthetic, his eyes met the sheriff's. "Remember that lesson, kid," he hissed before turning around and heading for his car. Jaden was left standing alone, with the prosthetic in his hand, surrounded by silence. In that moment, he vowed that this humiliation would not go unanswered. A crowd of bystanders began to gather around, some trying to figure out what was going on, others just watching from a distance. Jaden stood in front of the sheriff, clasping his hands to his chest as if it would protect him from further humiliation. But the sheriff, noticing the public's interest, only increased the pressure. "So, you've decided you can lead me around by the nose?" he said loudly, drawing attention to himself. "You think your specialness gives you the right to hide something?" He pointed at the boy's prosthetic with such a contemptuous grin that Jaden's insides clenched. "Yeah, I'm not hiding anything, sir." Jaden tried to explain again, but the sheriff interrupted him. "Shut up," he shouted. "People like you are always hiding something. I've seen it 100 times. The sheriff suddenly bent down and grabbed Jaden's leg without even warning. The boy tried to pull back, but the sheriff was stronger. He yanked at the prosthetic with such force that it snapped off, leaving Jaden wobbling on one leg. The crowd gasped. A few people pulled out their phones to film what was happening, but no one intervened. "Now, that's what I mean." The sheriff grinned, lifting his prosthetic up as if he'd caught his prey. "You clung to it because there's something there, didn't you?" Jaden lost his balance and fell to the sidewalk. He felt tears rolling down his cheeks, but he quickly wiped them away with his hand so the sheriff wouldn't see his weakness. "Please, give it back," he begged. "It hurts." "Does it hurt?" the sheriff asked, his voice full of mockery. "You're lucky I didn't send you straight to the station." The sheriff began twirling the prosthetic in his hands, examining it with the look of an expert. "Do you know how many times I've found stolen goods in these things?" he said loudly, addressing the crowd. "These special ones always think they can fool us." One of the passers-by ventured closer. He was a man in his 40s, wearing glasses, with an anxious expression on his face. "Hey, sir, would you stop it?" "It's a kid," he said, trying to be polite. The sheriff turned to him and his face became even more sullen. "Is there something you don't like?" he asked sharply. "Maybe you want to tell me how to do my job?" The man raised his hands and stepped back, realizing it was useless to argue. "That's what I thought," said the sheriff, turning back to the boy. Jaden sat on the ground, clutching his arm, which still hurt from the sheriff's tug. He looked up, meeting the gaze of the uniformed man. "Give me back my prosthesis, please," he whispered again, but his voice was weak. The sheriff ignored his words. He leaned over the prosthetic, tapped it with his finger, and then shook it as if he expected something valuable to fall out. "It's empty," he said disappointedly. Then he looked at Jaden, a mocking smile on his face. "But you know, kid, you remind me of one thing. Trusting people like you is always a mistake." He picked up the prosthetic and threw it with all his might into the trash can. The crowd gasped again, but no one intervened. "Take your trash and get out of here before I change my mind," he said, waving his hand. Jaden crawled slowly toward the trash can, his every movement accompanied by pain and humiliation. He could feel the stares of passers-by burning through him, but no one reached out to help him. He pulled the prosthetic from the trash, his fingers trembling with humiliation and anger. Tears glistened in his eyes, but he held back. He realized he couldn't show his weakness. "That's it, boy," the sheriff said, retreating to his car. "Remember this day, and maybe next time you'll think twice about getting in my face." The sheriff got into his car and drove away, leaving Jaden alone among the indifferent crowd. The boy slowly put on his prosthesis and rose to his feet. He felt anger boiling up inside him. It wasn't just humiliation, it was a promise to himself that he would never let anyone do that to him again. The sheriff shook the prosthesis roughly again, tapped it with his fist as if he were trying to uncover a hidden secret, but found nothing. He frowned, then grinned a cruel smile filled with contempt. "Empty as your excuses are," he said, turning to Jaden, who was still sitting on the sidewalk. The boy tried to rise, but pain and fear made his movements slow. "Please, sir, give me back my prosthetic," he begged. The sheriff looked at him contemptuously, as if he were dirt under his boots. "Give it back? Do you really think you deserve anything?" he said, addressing not only Jaden but also the silent bystanders who were watching. He paused, raising his prosthetic higher, as if displaying some ridiculous trophy. "That's what I'm most tired of," he continued loudly so that everyone could hear him. "These special ones always think that their pathetic position gives them the right to do whatever they want." Jaden pressed himself to the ground, as if trying to hide from the words that hurt him more than the physical pain. "Yeah, I didn't do anything wrong," he whispered, but the sheriff only laughed. "Of course he didn't," he said sarcastically. "That's what you all say, and then it turns out you have a trunk full of stolen goods or something." He took a few steps toward the nearest trash can, looking at the boy with cold derision. "Do you want your prosthetic?" he asked, stopping next to the urn. "Yes, sir. Please." Jaden was almost crying, his voice shaking, but he tried to maintain a modicum of dignity. The sheriff raised the prosthetic over the urn and grinned. "Take it back where you belong." And with those words, he threw the prosthesis into the trash can as if he were throwing away unwanted garbage. A thud echoed through the air, and the crowd watching it gasped. Jaden stared at the urn as if it wasn't his prosthesis that had been thrown into it, but his hope for justice. "What, boy?" the sheriff continued, grinning. "Now you can feel what it's like to be in your place." Some of the passers-by started muttering something. One man said loudly, "It's a child. Stop it." The sheriff turned to him and his gaze turned icy. "Do you want to replace him?" He threw it at me sharply. "Or do you like to go where you don't belong too?" The man fell silent and took a step back. No one else dared to interfere. "That's right," the sheriff said, casting one last glance at the crowd. Then he turned to the boy. "Well, go ahead and get your prosthetic. This may be the most important lesson you'll ever learn." Jaden rose slowly. His hands were shaking, his face burning with humiliation. But he knew he had no choice. He had to go to the urn to get back what was his. The crowd watched him waddle slowly toward the trash can. The sheriff stood beside him, arms crossed over his chest, a smug look on his face. When Jaden bent down to pull the prosthetic out of the trash, he felt his fingers touch the cold metal of the trash can. His heart clenched with shame, but he gritted his teeth and pulled the prosthetic out. "Look at that. The kid knows how to listen after all," commented the sheriff, chuckling. Jaden didn't answer anything. He just took the prosthetic, clutching it to him as if it were the last piece of his dignity. The sheriff took a step back, clearly enjoying his power. "Now, you know what happens when you mess with the law," he said as he headed for his car. "I hope this teaches you something." The sheriff got into his car and drove off without looking back, leaving the boy alone among the indifferent crowd. Jaden stared at him in silence. His body trembled with humiliation, but there was a spark inside him that could become a flame. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something much bigger. The crowd around them fell into a tense silence. No one dared speak as the sheriff stood before Jaden, grinning smugly, enjoying his moment of power. The boy was still clutching his stained prosthesis as if it were the last shard of his dignity. His gaze darted between the sheriff and the surrounding bystanders, who either avoided meeting his eyes or furtively filmed the scene on their phones. "Well, boy, did you learn anything?" The sheriff threw loudly, his voice rough, but now it sounded more personal, more insulting. "Guys like you ought to know your place." Jaden didn't answer, only lowered his eyes. He felt as if the sheriff's words were piercing through him, scarring him deeper than any physical wound. "You hear me, kid?" The sheriff continued, his voice growing louder to drown out any silent condemnation in the crowd. "Or is it in your blood to pretend you're above the law?" The sheriff took a step forward, standing over Jaden like a predator enjoying its prey. "You know what the funny thing is? You always demand equality," he said, looking down at the boy. "But equality has to be earned. And as long as people like you walk our streets, stealing, lying, and pretending to be victims, we will never be equal." The words spread through the air like poison, hanging for a moment between the sheriff and the crowd. There was a quiet gasp, but the sheriff didn't stop. "Tell me, boy, who are you anyway?" His voice became almost a whisper, but that made it sound even scarier. "Another one of those people who thinks they can get out of their messy lives by pretending like you're important?" Jaden tried to lift his head to meet the sheriff's gaze, but his eyes filled with tears again. He wanted to say something, to explain, but the words stuck in his throat. "You see," said the sheriff, grinning, "you can't even answer that, because you know I'm right." He turned to the crowd as if trying to draw them to his side. "Do you all see that?" he asked loudly, pointing at Jaden. "This is what happens when you give them too much freedom. They start to think they can do whatever they want." The people around them remained silent, though a few began to peek out from behind their backs to get a glimpse of the boy. A few women were talking quietly, clearly shaken, but no one dared to intervene. "Go back to where you came from," the sheriff said suddenly, his voice as cold as an icy wind. "That's where your life is. That's where your story is." Jaden gripped the prosthetic harder, as if it were his only shield against the blows he couldn't deflect. He realized he couldn't change anything right now. Any word would only make things worse. The sheriff, seeing the boy's silence, grinned again and turned to the crowd and made another gesture. "This is the real face of their problems," he said, looking into the eyes of those who dared to meet his gaze. "Do you want people like him walking your streets? Do you want your children playing with people like him?" Someone in the crowd lowered their head, trying to hide shame or fear, but the sheriff continued. "These people, they're always talking about injustice. But is it fair that we work, pay taxes, protect the streets, and they come and turn everything into chaos?" Jaden wanted to scream that he wasn't like that he wasn't doing anything wrong, that he was just walking home after school, but he knew no one would hear his voice. "Get out of here before I change my mind." The sheriff threw sharply, his eyes throwing lightning bolts. The crowd began to disperse, as if the sheriff's words were a signal that the show was over. People hurried away, trying to forget what they had just seen. Only a few people stayed, silently watching as Jaden slowly put on his prosthesis, his fingers trembling with humiliation and anger. When he finally rose, his eyes met those of the sheriff. The boy's gaze was no longer filled with fear. There was determination there, an anger that was barely contained. "You got it all figured out?" the sheriff asked, noticing the change. Jaden said nothing. He turned around slowly and leaned on his prosthetic and began to walk away. His back was straight, but every step hurt, not physical pain, but the kind of pain he would carry with him forever. The sheriff remained standing still, satisfied with his victory. He watched the boy walk away and didn't even notice the people around him filming his words and actions. He didn't realize that this day would change his life. He didn't realize that the boy he had humiliated was stronger than he could have imagined. Jaden waddled slowly down the street, every movement painful in his leg and chest, like the impact of a fist. His prosthesis, hastily fastened with trembling fingers, rubbed his skin, but that was the least of his problems. The worst was the stares of passers-by, frightened, judgmental, or worse, indifferent. No one came up to help him. No one offered support. Their silence and inaction shouted louder than any words. He could feel his back burning under the weight of their stares. The sheriff was right about one thing. Jaden couldn't count on anyone to help him. He was on his own, and he had to get used to that. But something new and indomitable was already growing inside him. It wasn't just anger. It was a sense of deep injustice that rippled through his every step. When he rounded the corner and the noise of the crowd died down, Jaden let himself stop. His hands were shaking with tension, and his heart was beating like a drum. He sat down on the low curb and inhaled deeply, trying to calm himself. But the memories of the sheriff and his humiliating words came back to him like sarcastic echoes. "People like you." Those words stuck in his ears. He never felt different until those around him reminded him of it. The sheriff only saw him as a skin color and a prosthetic, not a person, not a boy who just wanted to go home. Jaden closed his eyes and gritted his teeth. He couldn't think about it. He had to keep going. Rising to his feet, he took the first step, then the second, feeling the prosthesis creak and cause more and more pain. He was heading toward his home, a small house on the outskirts of town that hid his biggest secret. He never told anyone at school who his parents were. He avoided talking about it even with his friends. He liked to just be Jaden, a boy with a prosthesis but with vivid dreams. Few people knew that his father was the owner of one of the largest TV channels in the country. His mother, a famous journalist, was often in the news with high-profile investigations of corruption and injustice. Jaden knew that his family could easily use their influence to change this situation. They could destroy the sheriff at the push of a button by launching an entire campaign against him. But he didn't want his parents to know what had happened. Jaden didn't want them to see his weakness. He didn't want them to think he couldn't handle it. He wanted to be strong on his own, without their help, even if it meant enduring pain and humiliation. But this secret was also his curse. Every time someone humiliated him, he knew he could have just called his father or mother, and everything would have changed. But he didn't call. He never called. When he finally reached his house, he stood in front of the door for a few seconds before opening it. Silence greeted him inside. His parents weren't home. His mother was on the set again, and his father was having another meeting with investors. He sat down on the couch, breathing heavily, and looked at the stained denture. His fingers trembled as he tried to clean it. Every crack and scratch reminded him of what had happened. At one point, he just put the prosthesis on the floor and covered his face with his hands. Everything he was trying to hide inside suddenly came out. He sobbed, quietly, so no one would hear. They were tears not only from the pain, but also from the feeling of utter helplessness. He knew that sooner or later his parents would find out anyway. That thought kept him on his toes. If his mother saw the condition in which he had returned, she would act immediately. She would not allow her son to be victimized. But something inside Jaden still resisted. He wanted justice, but he wanted it in his own strength. The sheriff had to answer for his words and actions, but not through high-profile headlines or his parents' powerful connections. Jaden wanted to prove he was stronger than he looked. When he finally calmed down, he lifted his head and looked at himself in the mirror opposite. His eyes were reddened, but there was a spark in them. He knew this story wasn't over yet. Her ending would be very different, and that ending would be his choice. The evening was gloomy, and the heavy clouds seemed to reflect Jaden's inner state. He sat on the couch, staring at the TV on, but not really paying attention to what was on. The sheriff's words echoed over and over in his head. People like you. Those phrases were like shards of glass embedded in his mind, not allowing him to forget the humiliation. He was determined not to tell anyone what had happened. But the house was too quiet, and it was as if the silence made him sink deeper into his thoughts. Jaden didn't notice when the door opened and his mother, Leanna, appeared. A tall, confident woman, she had always been a symbol of justice and strength. Her investigative journalism had shaken the city and even the country, bringing the most powerful criminals to light. But now she froze when she saw her son. "Jaden, what happened?" she asked, noticing the dirty denture lying at his feet and the shadow of pain on his face. Jaden stirred as if he'd been caught off guard. He shook his head, trying to hide his condition. "It's okay, Mom. It's okay, Mom," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. But Leanna knew her son too well. She came closer, sat down beside him, and put her hand on his shoulder. Her voice was softer, but it was insistent. "That doesn't look like normal. Did someone hurt you? What happened?" Jaden felt the tears come to his eyes again. He wanted to hide it, but his mother's voice, her warmth and concern, broke down his defenses. He began to tell. Slowly at first, with difficulty, but then the words came pouring out. He told everything. How the sheriff had stopped him, how he'd taken off his prosthesis, how he'd thrown it in the garbage. He told of the taunts, of the racist comments, of the crowd that watched in silence. When he finished, the room was dead silent. Leanna listened silently, but her face grew harder. Her lips were tightly pressed together and her eyes glittered with anger. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice quiet but threatening. "Mom, please don't." Jaden started, but Leanna was already up. "Who was it?" she repeated, her voice louder. Jaden lowered his eyes and called out the sheriff's name. That was enough. Leanna turned around and headed for her phone. She dialed the number quickly, confidence and determination in her voice. David, it's Leanna. I need you to put a team together immediately. I want a front-page story on this sheriff tomorrow. All the details, his record, all the incidents he's been involved in. I want it all." She hung up the phone and turned to Jaden. "You think I'm going to let it go? You think I'm going to let this man humiliate you and others? No, Jaden. That sheriff's going to pay for everything." The next day, the town woke up to an explosion of news. Every newspaper, every channel aired a story about a sheriff who insulted and humiliated children. Photos, videos, eyewitness accounts were shown. People were learning that this was not the first case of abuse of power. Stories of his racist actions surfaced one after another. Leanne and her team created a full portrait of a man who thought his power was limitless. The sheriff, upon learning of the campaign, was furious. He tried to justify himself by calling it all lies and propaganda, but the evidence was too convincing. Soon he became a pariah even among his colleagues. The town began to demand his resignation, and those who really wanted to serve the people were nominated to replace him. Jaden watched everything from afar. It was hard for him to realize that his story had been the catalyst for such change. He felt proud of his mother for fighting for justice, but at the same time he knew this was only the beginning. The world was full of men like this sheriff, and fighting them required tremendous strength. When Jaden looked out the window, he saw people on the street discussing the news, reading newspapers, watching videos on their phones. He realized he was no longer alone. His voice was being heard. Now, the sheriff knew that people like Jaden are not just victims. They are a force that can change the world. The buzz around Jaden's story was gathering momentum. What started as a local news story quickly became a national sensation. Every major TV station ran stories about the sheriff who humiliated the child. A video taken by a passerby went viral. It captured the moment the sheriff ripped the prosthetic leg off Jaden's leg and threw it in the garbage. It was a picture full of cruelty and contempt, and it shocked millions of people. Panic reigned in the sheriff's office. His superiors demanded explanations, but every comment he made only made the situation worse. His claims that he was acting within the law sounded pathetic in the face of records and eyewitness testimony. When his past racist behavior began to surface in the media, and complaints from citizens from whom his office had previously protected him, it became clear that his days in office were numbered. Jaden hardly realized the magnitude of what was happening. He sat in front of the television, watching his name on every newscast. Journalists called his mother around the clock, and people began to gather outside the house, offering support or demanding details. Leanna, tireless and determined, continued to campaign. Her voice became a voice of justice for those who had long remained silent. One evening, as the family gathered in the living room, Leanna's phone rang. It was her lawyer. "We did it," he said. "The sheriff has been suspended. The investigation will begin tomorrow." Leanna hung up the phone and looked at Jaden. Her eyes sparkled, but there was a smile on her face. "It's not over," she said, "but it is the beginning." The next day, an official investigation began. The sheriff was summoned to court, where he was accused of abuse of power, racial discrimination, and use of unjustified cruelty. Each accusation was supported by evidence, video, eyewitness accounts, and official complaints that had previously been ignored. In court, the sheriff tried to defend himself, but his words did not resonate. When he said he acted because of the boy's suspicious behavior, the room erupted in whispers of indignation. His attempts to justify his actions only added fuel to the fire. "Do you believe that the color of the boy's skin makes him automatically a suspect?" asked the lawyer for Jaden's family during the interrogation. The sheriff tried to avoid answering, but the tension in the room was too great. His face reddened, he stammered, and then he spoke. "I was doing my job. People like him are often involved in problems." Those words were the final blow. The audience gasped, and the judge raised his hand for silence. The sheriff's words spread across the news instantly. Now, he wasn't just a man who had made a mistake. He had become a symbol of everything that people wanted to eradicate from the system. Soon, his career was over. He was fired, stripped of his pension, and then the civil lawsuits began. Jaden's family won the case, but their victory was bitter. Even though justice had been served, the trauma remained. Jaden couldn't forget those humiliating moments when he sat on the sidewalk and the sheriff stood over him, stripping him of his dignity. It left a mark that couldn't go away. However, Jaden decided that this experience should not break him. Together with his mother and father, he began participating in initiatives aimed at police reform. His story inspired others to speak up, to raise their voices against injustice. When he gave a speech on national television a year later, his voice shook, but he looked straight into the camera. "I don't want anyone else to go through what I had to go through. We are all equal, and no one deserves to be humiliated for who they are." His words spread across the country. People saw more than just a boy with a prosthetic limb. They saw strength and courage that inspired a generation to fight for justice. The sheriff, in turn, became a symbol of infamy. His name was only mentioned in the context of how the system could break down. But for Jaden, this wasn't just a victory. It was a chance to show that even in the darkest of times, you can find the strength to stand on your own 2 feet and keep going, even if that leg was a prosthetic. Thank you for watching this story to the end. We want to know your opinion. What do you think about what happened? Have you or someone you love experienced racism or injustice? Share your story in the comments because your voice is important to us. We appreciate each and every one of you, your support and participation. It helps us to raise important topics and tell stories that should not remain in the shadows. If you liked it, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like this video. This way, you will help more people learn about these important stories. We wish you a good day. Thank you for being with us.